I felt the metal stakes being driven into the ground before I saw them, a low rhythmic pounding that invaded my dreams just before dawn. I jerked awake, pulled on the nearest pair of boots, and rushed outside into the cool pre-dawn air. That's when I saw the harsh white glow of portable floodlights cast over my fields, a line of figures working with a grim sense of purpose, their shadows flickering against coils of chain-link fencing laid out like giant serpents on the grass. My name is Daniel Graves. I've lived on this farm since I was old enough to run around in my father's footprints. This land sits at the edge of a sprawling development called Greenhaven Hills, run by an HOA with a reputation for micromanaging every detail of its residents' lives. They've been encroaching on me for years, sending letters and memos, but I never imagined they'd come in the darkness to fence off my own crop. I marched straight down the dirt path that ran alongside our ranch stopple home, my breath visible in the chill of the night. I carried a flashlight clutched so tightly in my right hand that my knuckles ached. Adrenaline shot through me, feeding the pulse in my ears as I approached the noise. Once I was near enough to see faces, I spotted the uniform patches. Willow Acres Security. Only the HOA from Willow Acres, the more opulent sector of Greenhaven Hills, would have hired muscle for this job. At the center stood a tall woman with a short platinum haircut, barking orders. Even from behind, I could tell it was Karen Boyd. She'd been recently elected president of the Willow Acres Homeowners Association. Her posture gave her away. Perfectly rigid, arms folded behind her back as though she were a commanding officer surveying her troops. I came up on them so fast, one of the security guards nearly dropped a hammer. He spun to face me, blocking my path as I attempted to step around him. I glared up into the guard's face, noticing that the embroidered patch on his left sleeve said, "Willow Acres Private Services." He said nothing, just raised a hand to halt me. Over his shoulder, I saw Karen pivot in my direction with calculated slowness. She lifted her chin, lips poised in that half-smile that drives me up the wall. She'd been a thorn in my side for months, drafting letters about community standards and unsightly farmland, but this was a blatant escalation. I tried to push past the guard. He refused to let me through. "Ma'am," I called, careful to keep my tone steady. "You mind explaining what you're doing here before sunrise, on land that doesn't belong to your HOA? She sauntered closer, her high-heeled boots clacking against a portable metal plate they'd set on the soft earth. Her expression was eerily calm. "Daniel Graves, I'm sure you've been made aware of our new perimeter project. Willow Acres has expanded, and this farmland is now considered part of the extended community boundary. Our updated bylaws permit us to protect community property values by installing a security fence. This is an authorized operation." Something twisted in my gut. This farm isn't part of Willow Acres. My father and his father before him worked these fields. We never signed over any rights, never joined any HOA. And I sure as hell didn't give you permission to pound a fence through my soil. Karen's eyebrows rose, and her polished nails hovered near her chin in a mocking gesture of feigned sympathy. "I see that you're upset. It's understandable. However, Willow Acres has the right to preserve its aesthetic and safety standards. Our legal counsel verified it. If you have concerns, you may contact the association office during business hours." I glanced around, noticing how the workers had already begun rolling out sections of chain link attached to steel posts. The fence line stretched along the entire eastern side of my crop field and curved outward, threatening to encompass it entirely. A deep sense of violation nearly choked me. "You're not just fencing off a random patch of grass," I said, voice tightening with anger. "Those are my livelihood. Corn on the north end, tomatoes and peppers near the orchard. My orchard is the heart of this place. You can't lock me out." Karen turned her gaze to one of the security guards, gave a slight nod, and then looked back at me. "We're not trying to take your orchard, but it's essential that all farmland adjacent to our new residential expansions meets Willow Acres standards." If you refuse to comply with the guidelines, which require proper screening of commercial or agricultural operations, then you can't blame us for installing a fence to hide the blight from community view. Blight? The word caused my throat to go dry. My father used to say that farmland was the lifeblood of honest folks, not an eyesore. The fact that she dared to call my crops a blight made me want to tear down the fencing with my bare hands. I fought the impulse, though. Provoking them might lead to arrests and more headaches. Instead, I turned on my heel and stormed off, intending to call our family lawyer the minute I got inside. Behind me, hammers kept pounding. The sound echoed across my fields like a heartbeat marking the end of an era. Sunrise revealed the fence in all its insulting glory. Stretching 6 feet high, topped with barbed wire coils that sparkled in the early light, it formed a harsh boundary between my house and the orchard. I took my truck out to check if there was an opening at the back near the irrigation ditch that my father had dug decades ago. To my horror, they'd sealed that off too. No gates, just an unbroken perimeter of steel. The sign on the fence read, "Willow Acres, HOA. No trespassing. Violators subject to prosecution." I wanted to laugh at the absurdity, but couldn't muster more than a bitter grunt. Inside the farmhouse, my wife Alicia was pacing by the kitchen window. She'd seen what was happening, but didn't want to come out in the dark while those security guards were around. The second I walked in, her face twisted in worry. "Dan, are they going to shut us down? How can they do this?" She looked as though she'd spent the last hour scouring the internet for any legal recourse. I wrapped my arms around her shoulders. "They can't shut us down. This land isn't part of their stupid association. But they're convinced it is, or they've twisted some boundary rule to make it so. We'll figure it out." She pulled away to look into my eyes. "What's the plan? We can't keep letting them box us in. You have deliveries to make next week. The orchard will be in full bloom soon. We depend on that orchard for half our annual income." My stomach churned. "I'm calling Henry. He's a local lawyer who's handled farmland disputes before. Maybe there's a glitch in the county records, or the HOA's misinterpreting some zoning clause. One way or another, that fence can't stay." Alicia nodded, forcing a tight-lipped smile. "Whatever you need from me, I'll do it. I can gather the old property deeds, the surveys your father left." That gave me a spark of hope. "Yes, do that, please. We'll build our case. They're messing with the wrong farmer." By mid-morning, I was on the phone with Henry. He listened carefully. Then I heard him release a tired sigh. "I've been seeing an uptick in these HOA expansion tactics, especially for developments like Willow Acres. They sometimes leverage ambiguous municipal rules to claim oversight of adjacent properties if they argue it impacts property values. But that doesn't mean they have the right to fence off your land. We'll need all your original deeds, any grandfather clauses, county boundary maps. This is going to be an uphill battle, Dan, but we'll fight it." I thanked him and hung up, gazing out the window at the orchard. Rows of fruit trees stood quietly behind the fence, as if unsure why they were being imprisoned. My father, Jonathan Graves, had nurtured those trees from saplings, a legacy meant to outlive him and me. When he passed, I promised to keep the orchard thriving. It was more than a means of livelihood, it was a piece of family history. The thought that Karen and her polished nails, with her unwavering confidence and elitist outlook, believed she could treat that orchard like an inconvenient eyesore, made my blood boil. I spent the afternoon driving around, assessing just how bad the fencing situation was. Every corner of the farmland that bordered Willow Acres got sealed off. None of my farm equipment could pass through without a gate. They'd thoughtfully installed a single locked gate near the main road, presumably for their own access. A bulky padlock dangled from it, and a second sign declared that only Willow Acres board members were authorized to open it. Anger flared as I walked along the perimeter. This wasn't just an intimidation tactic. They wanted to control every aspect of my farmland, maybe to force me into selling. I kicked a clump of dirt, wishing I had a sledgehammer to smash that padlock, But I reined myself in, remembering Henry's advice. Stay calm, gather documentation, avoid any action that could be spun against you. 2 days later, a letter arrived from the HOA. It was addressed to me by name, complete with Willow Acres' official letterhead. Inside, a typed statement read that my farmland had been deemed a non-compliant commercial entity within the newly expanded boundaries. They recommended I cease all major agricultural operations or face fines. The letter also mentioned that the fence would remain in place for aesthetic and security reasons. Staring at those words, my head throbbed with fury. That farmland had fed the community for over 70 years, donated produce to local shelters, and employed seasonal workers. Now, they had the nerve to call it non-compliant. I drove to the Willow Acres HOA office the next morning with a letter in hand. The office was located in a fancy brick building near the entrance of their neighborhood, complete with manicured lawns and a glistening fountain. I shoved open the glass door, marched up to the receptionist, and demanded to speak to Karen Boyd. The receptionist, who wore a pinned name tag that said Sharon, gave me a startled look. She punched a number into the phone. Within minutes, Karen strutted out from a back hallway, wearing a fitted gray blazer and an expression of polished detachment. She motioned for me to follow her into a small meeting room. Once inside, I thrust the letter onto the table. Care to explain how you justify calling my orchard non-compliant commercial activity when it's been there longer than these houses? Karen sat down, folded her hands, and calmly met my stare. Mr. Graves, as I indicated before, we have new guidelines. Your farmland abuts Willow Acres' newly zoned residential sections. The board voted unanimously to require a perimeter fence to maintain community standards. We can't have a farm that fails to blend with the carefully curated aesthetic of Willow Acres. If your property is visible and doesn't meet our landscaping policies, it's a violation. You can't just impose your rules on land that isn't part of your development, I retorted, voice tightening. I never joined your HOA. I never signed anything that gives you that authority. She clicked her pen, eyes cold. The municipality recognized our boundary extension due to the farmland's direct impact on property values. The farmland is considered within the zone that the HOA can regulate. Should you disagree, you're free to take the matter up with the county or your own legal counsel, but I advise you to be mindful. Further non-compliance might result in daily fines. Additional legal fees may apply. My suggestion is to consider selling. Willow Acres might be willing to purchase the land and incorporate it into a greenbelt or a community orchard that meets our standards. You could save yourself a lot of stress. Her composure, the measured tone, the absolute confidence, it rattled me. But I refused to give her the satisfaction of seeing me falter. We'll see about that, I said quietly, turning on my heel before my anger got the better of me. As I left, she called after me in a syrupy voice. Have a wonderful day, Mr. Graves. We look forward to your cooperation. Outside, I breathed in the crisp morning air that smelled of trimmed hedges and chlorine from the HOA's decorative pond. In that moment, I vowed I'd never bow to her demands. This orchard was my birthright, and I wouldn't let the polished might of Willow Acres reduce it to a sideshow. Henry told me to gather every possible piece of documentation, so that became my mission. I rummaged through the old filing cabinets in the farmhouse, pulling out property deeds from the 1940s local ordinances that preceded Willow Acres, and even old diaries of my father that mentioned boundary lines. I also discovered a stack of county survey maps with faint pencil marks showing irrigation channels that crossed my fields, along with notations about a drainage ditch that led toward the lower basin near Willow Acres. Between phone calls to Henry and the county clerk's office, I learned about a potential wedge I could drive into the HOA's plan. The farmland had a recognized drainage easement. If the fence blocked or altered the natural drainage path for stormwater, Willow Acres would be in violation of county code. It was a small but crucial detail. The question was whether their fence truly interfered with the easement. I'd need to hire a surveyor to confirm. Meanwhile, Alicia noticed I was coming to bed later and later, my mind swimming with legal jargon. She tried to shoulder some of the research burden, but it took a toll. Our kids kept asking why we had a giant fence around the orchard, and we had to give them vague answers about grown-up problems. About a week after my confrontation with Karen, I decided to drive around the perimeter in broad daylight, filming a video on my phone. I captured every angle of the fence, close-ups of the barbed wire, and the posted signs threatening trespassers with prosecution. As I moved along the northern boundary, I noticed something that made my heart quicken. The fence crossed a shallow ditch that I knew was part of the historical drainage route. They hadn't placed a culvert or left a gap. The fence literally cut across the ditch, partially blocking it. If a heavy rain came, water would back up on my side, potentially flooding part of my field. That had to be a code violation. I sent the footage to Henry and started drafting a complaint for the county. A few days later, I woke to find yet another letter from Willow Acres. This one stated that I owed them maintenance fees for the fence that supposedly benefited my farmland by providing security. They even included an invoice. I felt my jaw tense so hard it threatened to crack a tooth. Not only had they robbed me of free access to my orchard, but they wanted me to pay for the privilege of being fenced out. It was an outrage, but also a twisted sign of their confidence. They believed they had me cornered. I fired off a firm response through Henry, refusing to pay a dime and insisting they remove the fence altogether. Of course, that wouldn't happen overnight. Meanwhile, we made progress on the drainage angle. The county sent an inspector named Morris to examine the ditch. He arrived on a drizzly afternoon and trudged around in heavy boots, measuring the flow pattern. Karen must have gotten word because she showed up halfway through the inspection with her own henchman, an attorney wearing a slick suit, who tried to lecture Morris about how the ditch was obsolete. Morris remained stoic, took his notes, and told both sides he'd compile a report. One evening, in the midst of that stressful period, I was sorting seeds in the barn when my phone rang. It was a number I didn't recognize, but I answered anyway. A low voice introduced himself as Gary Dunn, a disgruntled Willow Acres resident who claimed to be fed up with Karen's extreme methods. He said she and the board were bragging that they'd soon force me to sell. He didn't want to be identified publicly, but he hinted that many neighbors weren't happy with the HOA's aggression. Some had started complaining about the growing legal fees, suspecting that it would raise their HOA dues. They hadn't realized a farmland dispute could drag on for months. This was the first time I felt an inkling of hope that Karen might not have the total support she claimed. Soon after, I found a thread on a local online forum. Residents of Willow Acres were anonymously griping about their HOA. They mentioned that the board was funneling a huge portion of the budget into security patrols, fence maintenance, and lawyers. The general sentiment: Karen had turned into a dictator, pushing an agenda that didn't align with the entire community. It struck me that if I could harness that internal dissent, maybe I could loosen the HOA's iron grip on my orchard. Meanwhile, Henry pressed the county to expedite the drainage complaint. We also explored the orchard's environmental significance. Alicia discovered old records showing that the orchard was home to an endangered species of local bird that nested in some of the taller apple trees. If we could prove the fence threatened that habitat, we might have a second angle. But that required more fieldwork and possibly an environmental consultant. The finances for such an effort weren't trivial, especially since we were losing business due to restricted orchard access. Some of our usual customers and local produce stands were hesitant to place orders when they heard about the fence fiasco. I recall one day distinctly. Alicia and I walked along the orchard's edge, separated from our trees by that cold mesh of metal. Through the fence, we could see rows of blossoms trembling in a light breeze, petals drifting to the ground. It should have been a time of renewal, of fresh beginnings, but instead it felt like we were visiting someone in prison. She slipped her hand into mine. "We're going to fix this," she said softly. I squeezed back, trying not to let my frustration show on my face. In that moment, I despised Karen not just for her arrogant meddling, but for robbing us of the simple joy of caring for our orchard. As the weeks dragged on, Henry discovered another critical document in the county archives, a record that the farmland was subject to a historic farmland preservation clause, signed decades ago by my grandfather. It stated that any attempt to convert the farmland for residential purposes required a special permit and thorough review by the county agricultural board. Willow Acres never sought such a permit. That gave us additional ammunition, though we needed time to gather statements and mount an official complaint. Karen, meanwhile, must have sensed that we weren't rolling over. She became more brazen, sending me daily violation notices. One insisted that my tractor stored in the open was an eyesore that violated vehicle screening guidelines. Another claimed that the orchard's signage needed to be approved by the HOA. I laughed at that one because we'd never posted orchard signs in the first place. But it all piled up, forming a paper trail of harassment. My mailbox felt like it overflowed with her petty demands. The final straw came when a group of Willow Acres residents, presumably led by Karen, showed up at the fence one afternoon while I was out in the field. They peered through the chain link as if visiting a zoo. One woman in a pink visor snapped photos with her phone, audibly complaining about how the orchard smelled like dirt and was ruining her scenic jogging route. Another tall man pointed at the irrigation ditch, saying, "Can't we just fill that up? It's so ugly." I stood there about 50 feet away, fists clenched, biting my tongue. They acted like I was invisible. Eventually I walked over, gave them a curt nod, and they scattered back toward their luxury SUVs. A part of me felt humiliated that they could just treat my family's land like a curiosity or nuisance. Another part of me was determined to show them they'd picked the wrong fight. Henry had been building our case for months now, and finally the day arrived for a hearing with the county, a preliminary step that might lead to an order demanding the fence be moved or removed if found in violation of the drainage rules. Karen's attorney planned to attend, of course. Alicia and I dressed in our best clothes that morning, not fancy by Willow Acres standards, but respectable. We stood outside the county building at sunrise, waiting for Henry. A small group of local reporters milled about, apparently intrigued by the farmland dispute that had been the subject of local gossip. Inside, the hearing was held in a modest courtroom. The county board members sat behind a long table. The air smelled faintly of old coffee and disinfectant. Karen arrived with two attorneys, wearing a tailored navy suit and that imperious expression she perfected. When the hearing began, Henry presented evidence. Photos, surveyor reports, historical property maps, and witness statements. He pointed out how the fence cut across a recognized drainage ditch and how no permit was obtained to alter that ditch. Karen's lead attorney argued that the ditch was irrelevant because Willow Acres had newly established rights to manage water flow within their boundaries. But Henry countered by producing the Farmland Preservation Clause. One of the board members, an older gentleman with a keen interest in local history, asked pointed questions about the orchard's significance and the practicality of blocking drainage. For a moment, I thought Karen might shift tactics. She looked uneasy under that scrutiny. But her attorney doubled down, claiming everything was legal under updated municipal codes. That's when Henry calmly revealed a letter from the county archives indicating that updated codes wouldn't override certain farmland protections. I watched Karen's confident mask waver. At the end of the hearing, the board stated they needed time to deliberate. They'd send a written decision in a few weeks. No immediate resolution, but I caught the flicker of worry in Karen's eyes. Outside, a local reporter asked me for a statement. I said simply, "All we want is the right to work our land without intrusion. Farmland is part of this county's heritage. We're hopeful the board does the right thing." Erin walked by, close enough for me to catch a hint of her floral perfume. She paused briefly, whispered, "You can't keep fighting progress, Mr. Graves. It's only going to cost you more in the end." Then she strode away, flanked by her attorneys. Something about her tone sent a chill down my spine, like she had an ace up her sleeve. That fear wasn't unfounded. 2 days after the hearing, an SUV from the County Code Enforcement Division arrived at my doorstep. They claimed someone had filed a complaint that my old barn was structurally unsafe and harbored pests. I nearly laughed. That barn was in good condition and no pests had been cited, but the officer insisted on inspecting. Though I had nothing to hide, the process took 2 hours, culminating in a minor note about needing fresh paint. The officer apologized, adding that these types of anonymous complaints had skyrocketed recently. He suspected the HOA was filing them in retaliation. The sheer pettiness was staggering. I spent each morning letting the orchard remind me why this fight mattered. Walking among the apple trees, running a hand along the rough bark, I remembered my father's lessons on patience. He taught me that you don't force a tree to blossom on your schedule. You nurture it, wait for the right season, and trust that the harvest will come. In many ways, fighting an HOA was like coaxing fruit from a stubborn branch. If you rushed, you might break the branch and ruin the harvest. So I pressed on, trusting that each legal step was another rung up the ladder toward justice. Then came the break I needed. A letter from the county board arrived, stating that their preliminary ruling found Willow Acres in potential violation of the drainage ordinance. They instructed the HOA to either modify or remove the fence segments obstructing the ditch until a full review could be done. It wasn't an outright victory, but it meant the HOA had to adjust the fence line, potentially reopening some access to my orchard. I read that letter about 3 times, a slow grin spreading across my face. Henry told me not to celebrate prematurely. Karen could file an appeal. Still, just having an official declaration that the fence likely violated county rules shifted momentum in our favor. Sure enough, a few days later, I saw workers at the fence pulling out a short section near the ditch. They replaced it with a narrower structure that left a gap so water could flow. It was progress, albeit a small portion. The main orchard area remained behind barbed wire. Around that time, I overheard from a neighbor that Karen was courting investors to build a new recreational facility for Willow Acres, featuring tennis courts and a pool. The plan involved hooking into a municipal water line that ran under the southern tip of my farmland. If that was true, then they'd need some form of easement from me eventually. I realized that might be the ultimate leverage. They wanted that pipeline access. If they insisted on fencing me out, they'd soon find themselves fenced out of water. With this in mind, I started quietly investigating. Sure enough, a municipal water main turned southward through a portion of the farmland that was never included in Willow Acres' original boundary. They'd need permission, or they'd have to build a costly new main around my land. It became clear, if Karen wanted to keep her expansion dreams afloat, she'd have to negotiate with me. As I was piecing this together, I discovered something else. The Willow Acres clubhouse, the grand building where the HOA held their meetings and events, was actually on a piece of land leased from a retired developer who lived in another state. Rumor had it that the lease might be up for renewal soon. I had no immediate plan for that information, but I tucked it away. Maybe it would become relevant if Karen pushed me too far. Sure enough, she did. A week after the fence was partially modified, I received a special assessment invoice from Willow Acres claiming my farmland required enhanced security measures that the HOA had generously provided. The sum was outrageous, thousands of dollars. It was the final straw. They were effectively billing me for the fence they'd illegally built. I marched into Henry's office, slammed the invoice onto his desk, and said, "I'm done playing nice. Let's see how Karen reacts if we start exploring every angle, including that water pipeline. They need us more than we need them. I'm willing to fight this until Willow Acres is forced to back off entirely." Henry nodded, rolling up his sleeves. We spent hours mapping out a more aggressive strategy. We'd demand the fence be fully removed, not just partially modified. We'd also start discussions with the municipality about the water main, making it clear that I had no obligation to grant an easement to Willow Acres. It was time to show them that intimidation and cunning can go both ways. Meanwhile, the orchard reached peak bloom. It was stunning, thousands of white blossoms shimmering in the sun, bees darting between flowers, a gentle hum of life that reminded me of how precious this land was. Residents from Willow Acres sometimes wandered by the fence to gawk at the sight, snapping pictures as though it was their personal scenic backdrop. I even overheard a mother telling her daughter that the orchard was so pretty if only that messy farmer would keep it all trimmed to HOA standards. Their arrogance never ceased to amaze me. Alicia and I tried to keep life normal for the kids. We'd do nightly readings, share dinner around the old wooden table, talk about simpler things. But the tension weighed on us. Bills were piling up, legal fees were no joke, and the orchard harvest was partially disrupted by the fence limiting tractor access. I considered temporarily scaling back production to save money, but that would have impacted families who counted on my produce, so we limped along, hoping the legal breakthroughs would come before financial strain crushed us. One evening, I got a call from Lucy Henson, an HOA board member who'd been increasingly vocal against Karen. She said she wanted to talk privately. We met in a local diner at the edge of town, one not frequented by Willow Acres residents. Lucy explained that the board was fracturing. Many members were tired of Karen's aggressive approach, worried about legal repercussions and the ballooning budget. She revealed that the next board election could shift power away from Karen if enough members were convinced. I asked Lucy why she was telling me this. She said, "Because I'm a longtime resident and I remember when your father would let the kids pick apples for free on weekends. Karen wasn't even living here then. The orchard was always beloved by the community. Now she's turned it into some bizarre symbol of defiance. We don't all share her point of view." Hearing that gave me hope. I told Lucy that I wanted nothing more than to continue farming in peace, as we had for decades, without a barbed wire fence dividing my property. She promised to keep me posted if any new motion came up on the board regarding the orchard. It was a small sign that not everyone in Willow Acres had fallen under Karen's spell. Then came the day that changed everything. I'd noticed an unusual flurry of activity at the clubhouse. Construction contractors, surveyors, and well-dressed individuals who looked like investors. They were likely evaluating the site for the rec center project. I hopped into my truck, drove around the perimeter until I found the southern road that led toward the water main. I saw a fresh marking flag stuck in the ground, presumably to map potential pipeline routes. Following them, I confirmed the route cut right across my farmland, well outside Willow Acres' original boundary. Without my explicit permission, they couldn't proceed. That same week, Henry told me he'd discovered the clubhouse lease was set to expire in less than a year. The owner, a man named Francis Ward, might be open to selling the land if he was fed up with the HOA. I decided to contact him discreetly. It turned out Francis was indeed frustrated with Willow Acres over some unpaid fees for maintenance. He didn't like HOAs in general, calling them bullies who prey on people who just want a place to live. We struck up a conversation, and he mentioned he'd be willing to sell the parcel if the price was right. That could be a game changer. Owning the clubhouse land meant I could hold the HOA by the throat if they refused to remove the fence. I spent weeks negotiating quietly with Francis. Meanwhile, Karen pressed forward with new fines, ignoring the county's partial ruling and daring me to escalate. She probably believed the law was on her side, or that I'd run out of money before I could fight her effectively. She had no clue I was in talks to buy the very ground under her fancy clubhouse. Eventually, Francis and I reached an agreement, and I formed a small LLC to purchase the parcel to keep my name out of immediate public records. When the deal closed, I felt an electric surge of triumph. The next step was waiting for the official recording to be posted. Once it was, Karen's illusions of unassailable power would start to crumble. A month later, the county's final hearing on the drainage issue arrived. By then, Lucy had leaked that Karen was scrambling to keep the board from hemorrhaging funds on lawsuits. The hearing concluded with the county ordering Willow Acres to rectify the fence's full compliance, which effectively meant removing large portions of it or facing daily fines. They also acknowledged the orchard's farmland preservation status, further complicating the HOA's claim. As the order was read, Karen's face was a mask of silent rage. Her attorney's attempts to protest were overruled. I walked out of that hearing with my shoulders squared. It felt like a corner had been turned. Not long after, the real bomb dropped. Willow Acres discovered I owned the clubhouse land. A swift panic must have engulfed them. Karen rushed to schedule an emergency board meeting, presumably to address the crisis. The community newsletter included a vague mention of unexpected developments regarding clubhouse property ownership. Several Willow Acres residents posted on social media, confused and angry at the board for allowing such a crucial piece of their neighborhood to slip into private hands. Rumors spread that Karen had threatened to sue the previous owner, but Francis had all his paperwork in order. The sale was perfectly legal. Before the board could even strategize, Henry prepared a formal letter to Willow Acres, stating that unless they removed the entire fence blocking my orchard and ceased all harassment, I would refuse any lease renewal on the clubhouse land, effectively evicting them once their current lease ended. Furthermore, I could charge them a steep monthly rent if they stayed. We also pointed out that, with me owning that land and controlling the pipeline route, the rec center expansion project was on life support unless they came to reasonable terms. Karen's defiance finally crumbled under the weight of multiple fiascos. The county's drainage ruling, the farmland preservation status, the orchard's environmental significance, the lost clubhouse land, and the pipeline blockade. The next day, I saw contractors arrive to begin dismantling large sections of the fence around my orchard. No official apology was given, just an abrupt compliance with the county's order. Within a week, the orchard stood free again, open to the sunshine without barbed wire or padlocks. When I walked through that space for the first time since they fenced it off, I felt tears prick my eyes. It was as if I'd regained a piece of my soul. The orchard blossoms swayed in the breeze, no longer caged by cold metal. A few residents from Willow Acres came by on a Saturday morning, leaning over the half-removed fence posts to say they were sorry for the trouble. One older man admitted he'd voted for Karen, thinking she'd keep the neighborhood safe and tidy, never imagining she'd turn into a tyrant. I nodded politely. While their apologies were appreciated, part of me still resented the months of stress and lost income, but I let it go. More important was the orchard's freedom and the future of my farm. Karen tried to cling to her presidency, but the board called a special session. Lucy mentioned that in a near-unanimous vote, Karen was removed. She gathered what remained of her dignity and resigned from the HOA entirely, listing her house for sale at a laughably high price. As word spread about the orchard fiasco, potential buyers were few. Eventually, she cut her losses and disappeared from Willow Acres altogether. The new board, more humbled and eager to avoid another catastrophe, approached me about a proper settlement. We hammered out terms. No more interference with my farmland, no more fines, and a sealed agreement that recognized the orchard was outside their jurisdiction. In return, I agreed to negotiate an easement for the pipeline, ensuring they could build a more modest rec center if they followed county laws and respected my property lines. I also found myself in a comfortable position regarding the clubhouse lease. They'd have to pay a reasonable rent if they wanted to keep using it. The friction simmered down, replaced by a cautious peace. At last I could turn my attention back to what mattered: planting seeds, maintaining the orchard, and providing fresh produce to the local community. One crisp morning, I stood under a blooming apple tree, inhaling the sweet scent of blossoms. The orchard was alive with bees and birds. I thought of my father, how he'd walk these rows at dawn, proud of every new bud that promised a future harvest. I'd nearly lost it all to a woman with too much power and not enough respect for legacy and heritage. But in fighting back, I'd gained more than I ever expected. Not just the orchard's freedom, but an unshakable awareness of how important it is to stand up for what's right, no matter how intimidating the opponent. Some neighbors asked if I planned a public celebration to commemorate the orchard's liberation. I declined, deciding a quiet personal reflection suited me better. The orchard didn't need fanfare. It needed tending, pruning, and care. That was celebration enough. Alicia and I did, however, throw a small gathering for friends and family who'd supported us. Henry came, Lucy dropped by to offer belated thanks, and even a couple of apologetic Willow Acres folks joined. We roasted corn, grilled fresh vegetables, and sat on hay bales watching the sunset. Someone strung up fairy lights between two tall apple trees, casting a warm glow over the orchard. For a moment, the entire fiasco felt like a distant memory. As the weeks passed, I formalized the orchard's status as protected farmland, working with the state's Agricultural Preservation Office. The knowledge that I'd secured it for future generations filled me with gratitude. Our children, running under the branches in late afternoon light, would one day inherit a legacy that no HOA could snatch away. When rumors circulated that Willow Acres was downsizing its expansion plans, I wasn't surprised. The fiasco likely taught them a lesson, or at least made them more cautious. I sometimes heard complaints that the rec center was delayed, or that the membership dues were higher to cover legal costs. It wasn't my concern anymore. As long as the orchard was safe, I could focus on being a good steward of the land rather than battling misguided bureaucracy. I occasionally glimpsed the remains of fence posts on the outskirts of the property. Workers had hauled off most of the chain link, but some concrete bases were still buried in the ground. It served as a subtle reminder that freedom isn't guaranteed. You have to defend it. For me, that meant staying vigilant. Henry insisted we keep thorough documentation in case future HOA boards got any wild ideas. He joked that I'd become the most legally prepared farmer in the county. Maybe he was right. I'd do anything to keep this orchard thriving and unchained. On a misty morning, I walked alone through the rows of apple trees, letting my fingertips brush the leaves. Everything glistened with dew. A few blossoms quivered in the gentle breeze. I paused where the fence had once loomed, thinking about how it had felt to be caged out of my own livelihood. The swirl of anger and helplessness came back for a moment, along with the memory of Karen's smug face. I exhaled slowly, letting the tension dissipate. That fence was gone, the orchard was free, and we were stronger, wiser, and more resilient for having fought back. Those orchard blossoms fluttered around me like falling snow, each petal a symbol of renewal. I leaned against a sturdy trunk and gazed toward the farmhouse. Inside, Alicia would be making breakfast. The kids running around in their pajamas. Life, for all its hardships, still had a softness and beauty that no fence could lock away. I took a final, deep breath of the orchard air, a blend of earth and new beginnings, then turned to head back home. There was work to do. Seeds to plant, a family to care for, and a future to shape. Nothing was more certain in my mind than this: the orchard belonged to us, and no matter how many fences an HOA might try to raise, we would tear them down one by one until the only barrier that remained was the unwavering resolve in our own hearts.